Media and Broadband will now come to order. Today, the subcommittee is convening a hearing on communications networks, safety, and security. I want to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Thune, and Senator Moran for filling in for him today, as well as Chair Cantwell and Ranking Member Cruz for working with me to schedule this hearing on such an important topic. I think every member of this committee can agree that there's nothing more important than keeping our communities safe. That's why I've worked with my Commerce Committee colleagues to make our aviation system safer, to prevent roadway fatalities, and to protect consumers from fraud and scams. It's also our responsibility to keep our communication networks safe, to ensure that foreign threat actors like China cannot infiltrate our infrastructure or steal Americans' data. Currently, our communities, our schools, hospitals, our libraries, our police departments, and emergency responders do not have the resources to defend themselves against foreign adversaries. The Sol Typhoon hacks that were discovered last month demonstrate that even the largest corporations in the United States are vulnerable. This attack likely represents the largest telecommunications hack in our nation's history. There's a lot that we still don't know about the damage that was done by the Sol Typhoon hacks, but what we do know is that more must be done to prevent attacks like this in the future. There are outstanding recommendations from federal agencies that must be fully implemented across our networks. This includes standards and best practices recommended by the FCC, Team Telecom, and other federal partners. One obvious thing we can do today is get equipment manufactured by companies that collaborate with foreign adversaries out of our American networks. Congress passed the Secure and Trusted Communication Networks Act in 2020, making it clear that we understand the vital importance of removing Huawei and ZTE equipment from every network across the country. Unfortunately, the RIP and Replace program has remained partially unfunded for years, opening up our networks to unnecessary risks and preventable threats. I'm hopeful that there's strong bipartisan agreement to fully fund this program through this year's National Defense Authorization Act and address one of the major known vulnerabilities facing our networks every day, once and for all. We also need to protect our networks at every access point, from phones to cars and even baby monitors. Critically, this includes the undersea cables that carry traffic across the entire world. As the pressure on our networks continues to increase, it is vital that federal partners do everything in their power to keep the bad actors out at every point of the supply chain. We are fortunate to have an expert panel with us today who will speak to the vulnerabilities in our communication system and how we can address them to protect our constituents. James Lewis, Senior Vice President and Director of the Technology and Public Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, will speak to how foreign threat actors like China work to infiltrate global telecommunication infrastructure to further their intelligence goals. Justin Sherman, founder and CEO of Global Cyber Strategies and non-resident senior fellow for the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, will speak to how companies and the federal government keep our network safe, especially undersea cables. Tim Donovan, President and CEO of Competitive Carriers Association, will discuss how small carriers across the country navigate cybersecurity challenges, including the need to remove Chinese equipment from their networks. And finally, James Malvinet, pronounce that for me, sir. Mulvanen, PhD, Chief Intelligence Officer at Premier Consulting, who Senator Moran will introduce, is joining us today as well. I look forward to a productive conversation today, and I want to thank each of you for being here. With that, I want to turn this over to our acting ranking member, Senator Moran, for his opening statement.
Chairman Lujan, thank you very much. Thank you for suggesting and making certain that this important hearing took place. I have a goal of working more closely with you now and in the future, and this is a nice way to start. I'm also pleased to be here because my introduction and understanding of this issue mostly comes from my service on the Senate Committee on Intelligence, where it seems to me we're handicapped in our ability to explain to the public and to make awareness of the necessities of making significant changes in the way that we do our business. So I'm pleased that we're having an open hearing to discuss and provide information to our constituents. Chinese hackers have infiltrated our telecommunications system, invaded the privacy of millions of Americans, and compromised our national security, exposing glaring weaknesses in our communications infrastructure. We need to understand how this hack happened and what we need to do to bring it to an end. We also need to know how to establish effective deterrence that makes China think twice about future violations of American infrastructure. While it's important that we act quickly, we need to make certain that the policies that we implement work to solve the problem and don't have those things we often call unintended consequences. I'm particularly concerned that rushed regulations could increase compliance costs for smaller telecom companies, thereby decreasing resources that are actually available for cybersecurity efforts. We must not only address this single event, but also investigate the path forward that ensures growth of secure networks for all Americans in all parts of the country. Securing our telecommunications network is not a new topic for this committee or for Congress as a whole. As Chairman Lujan indicated, I joined in 2019 my colleagues in sponsoring the Secure and Trusted Telecommunications Network Act, which established the commonly known RIP and Replace program. That program, which will reimburse eligible telephone companies for removing and replacing unsecured Chinese equipment in their networks, is currently facing a $3 billion shortfall in funding. There are companies in Kansas, like United Wireless in Dodge City, Kansas, that have been able to remove the problematic equipment while still providing their customers with the same level of service they've come to expect, but yet in the absence of the funding that RIP and Replace has been offered to provide. That's not the case for everyone, and I'm pleased to see that the NDAA included bipartisan provision to fill this funding gap. RIP and Replace program demonstrates that Congress can take bipartisan action to secure our networks, an approach that is urgently needed now as we take steps to confront the challenges posed by China. As a member of this committee and the Select Committee on Intelligence, I'll continue to work with my colleagues and federal agencies on a coordinated effort to secure our telecommunications network. But as I said earlier, I think one of the most important things is for the public to understand the challenges that they face and that we face. Mr. Chairman, thank you once again for calling this hearing. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To our colleagues, we're to move on to questions now, but we may have some opening remarks from the chair and the ranking member of the full committee as well later in this. But let's get to questions, and I'll recognize myself right now for 5 minutes. The providers that Competitive Carriers Association represents are the smallest, most rural providers across the country. They not only serve thousands of Americans, but thousands of our most vital community institutions, schools, libraries, hospitals. Well, I apologize. I've just been corrected that I'm just jumping straight to my questions with my interest in this hearing as opposed to hearing from our distinguished panel. So let me jump to that. I appreciate that. I appreciate that, Senator Moran. But with that being said, why don't we jump to Dr. Lewis for his opening statement. We'll each recognize you for 5 minutes. Dr. Lewis, you're up, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Moran. I thought you'd let us off the hook, so I'm a little disappointed, but let me thank the committee for the opportunity to testify on one of the most pressing strategic problems facing the U.S. The scale and audacity of Chinese espionage is unprecedented. Microsoft must have a machine that generates funny names because the Chinese don't call themselves Silk Typhoon. It appears they may be Unit 61938, an intelligence unit first indicted in 2014. If it is 61938, we know their names, we have their pictures. It's been 10 years and they've been very busy. Our response has been to give them a stern lecture and send a few strongly worded notes. We even managed to convict a Chinese spy in 2022, but then we let him go. The signal this sends is that it's open season on the US. The conventional responses to espionage do not work with China. Also, a country can't lose 2 wars and expect the same level of respect. Every year, the Chinese are less cautious. Chinese exploitation of telecommunications for spying began In the early 2000s and has continued across 4 administrations, it's increasingly dangerous. All great powers use communications intelligence. The US is no slacker in this regard, something the Chinese will happily point out to you if you discuss it with them. The internet has made spying even easier. China has built a comprehensive system for global communications espionage. China targets space assets, undersea cables, and telecom infrastructures, all accompanied by extensive hacking. The Chinese have had remarkable successes against the US, and Salt Typhoon is only the latest. It should not be seen as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger Chinese campaign to systematically exploit global telecommunications networks. Salt Typhoon may have let China see some surveillance orders submitted to US telcos, FISA surveillance orders, showing which of its agents had been compromised. And there are reports that China acquired metadata and content from numerous high-value US targets by accessing their phone calls and texts. Everyone on this committee is a target. The US hopes it can improve its defenses to the point where a giant, well-resourced and hostile opponent will face insurmountable obstacles. This hasn't worked. Countering China requires 2 sets of actions. The first is a sustained and forceful effort to disincentivize Chinese espionage. So far, espionage has been penalty-free for China. Second, we need an expanded effort to harden telecommunications networks. Rip and replace is an important part of this. Hardening falls within the remit of the committee. This committee can make clear that FCC is the agency in charge and that regulation is necessary. Using CALIA as a stopgap. The current administration has taken steps to improve cybersecurity, and the next administration should continue them. This committee can perform a valuable service by making clear that securing telecommunications networks must be an immediate priority for the US. In preparing for this, someone asked me, well, why should your average consumer, why should your citizen care? Putting aside the larger issues of national security, having a foreign power, a hostile foreign power with the ability to turn off the lights, turn off your phones, is not a position that is very comfortable for your average American. And so I hope one thing we can get from this hearing is a better understanding of that. I thank you and will be happy to answer any questions.
Dr. Lewis, thank you very much. Mr. Sherman, founder, CEO of Global Cyber Strategies, non-resident senior fellow for the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council.
Subcommittee Chair Lujan, Ranking Member Moran, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. When most Americans go on the internet, they connect via Wi-Fi on their laptops or cell service on their smartphones. What often goes unnoticed is a critical piece of the infrastructure behind it, which carries 99% of the world's intercontinental internet traffic, submarine cables. More than 500 submarine cables, as thick as a garden hose, and we can thank staff, we have a little snippet of one here. These carry internet data between cities, between continents. Dozens more of these cables are on the way. We'll easily hit 600-700 in the next few years. They enable worldwide information flows, commerce, scientific research, military communications, and much more. Private sector American companies have long played a pivotal role in the financing, construction, laying, and management of submarine cables connected to the United States and between other countries around the world. Historically, cable investment and ownership from the United States was led by firms such as AT&T and Verizon. Today, the dominant investors in and owners of subsea cables are 4 companies: Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft. Submarine cables are expensive and complex and frequently cross many borders, and so international collaboration is an important and necessary and a largely positive fact of maintaining this global network. It's likewise essential for US companies to continue competitively innovating in this area and playing their part around the world. But there are serious threats to the security and the safety and the resilience of submarine cables and to US national security that require government action. Submarine cables are damaged hundreds of times a year, most often by accident, such as from fishing boats that go close to shore, drag an anchor, and snap this very thin cable that we have here on the table. Most damage is not intentional, but At the same time, this doesn't fully capture, and industry often fails to appreciate, the serious, persistent, and ongoing national security threats to cables across espionage, supply chain compromise, and even physical targeting, especially from the Chinese and Russian governments. Foreign actors can potentially tap into cables at numerous points along the route, including during repairs or by hacking into remote cable systems. Cutting one cable is thankfully not going to knock out our country's internet or the world's, but damaging a cable could disrupt data flows, could cause traffic to be diverted through points, for example, the Chinese government can intercept, and much, much more. Beyond that, Chinese state-owned telecoms are the major investors out of China in these cables. Chinese firms are heavily involved in subsea cable repair. And Russia, meanwhile, is accelerating development of military and intelligence capabilities to surveil and physically target, including cut subsea cables. Incidents in Hawaii, the Baltic Sea, most recently, the Red Sea, numerous and growing incidents in the South China Sea and elsewhere underscore these national security threats. This is why for decades the US has had Team Telecom, an interagency group advising the FCC on national security threats, including to submarine cables. It operated informally for decades, and President Trump formally established Team Telecom as a committee by executive order in 2020, which President Biden has kept in place. Team Telecom has struggled before with a lack of focus on China, with major operational and transparency issues, but especially since President Trump's executive order and other actions, it has made huge progress in transparency and a focus in particular on the Chinese government's threat to this infrastructure. Given the risks, particularly from Beijing and Moscow, Congress should consider at least 4 things. One is keep encouraging Team Telecom's transparency. The second is to statutorily authorize Team Telecom to make sure it has the appropriate authorities. The third is to commission a study on China's involvement in and threats to subsea cables. And the fourth is to request a lessons learned report from Team Telecom to inform future action. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Tim Donovan, President and CEO of the Competitive Carriers Association.
Chairman Lujan, Senator Moran, Ranking Member Cruz, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the importance of providing safe and secure connectivity for all Americans. CCA represents communications providers ranging from small and rural to regional and nationwide, as well as vendors and suppliers. Our members are often the only provider for portions of their service area, delivering life-saving connectivity across rural America for their subscribers, as well as millions of Americans that roam onto their networks. This hearing is timely, as new details of compromised networks fill headlines daily. While work continues to analyze and secure networks, it is important to look at broader threat landscape and for Congress and federal government to take steps to promote safe and secure networks. This includes fully funding the $3.8 billion shortfall needed to complete the Rip and Replace program. Promoting work between communications providers and federal partners with clear and unambiguous cybersecurity guidance, and beginning work now to take steps in the 119th Congress to preserve and expand connectivity with a focus on security. CCA thanks this committee for passing the legislation that created the reimbursement program. The program should have been complete this past July under the initial timeline, but significant amounts of covered equipment and services remain in place today because of insufficient funding. The situation is dire. Rural providers are being forced to decide where to remove equipment but not replace it, cutting off service, including for 911. These decommissioning decisions are permanent choices that are detrimental to service availability and even entire businesses. These decisions are agonizing for our members because they live in the communities they serve, and impacts go beyond their customers. For example, 5 program participants that collectively serve fewer than 200,000 subscribers connected over 60 million Americans last year who roamed onto their networks because no other service was available. This equipment remains in service right now, including near military bases, airports, and other areas of strategic importance. Further, because the equipment cannot be properly maintained or upgraded, every day that passes increases the risk of catastrophic network failures. Because it is illegal to procure new equipment and services from untrusted vendors, carriers with this equipment cannot properly patch and upgrade software to defend against emerging threats or even perform basic maintenance. They cannot work with the manufacturers to identify problems or resolve issues. If Salt Typhoon can hack major operators, then there's a flashing red light for Rip and Replace networks that do not have the same resources. The national security risk also goes beyond the reimbursement program participants. Because of the fundamentally interconnected nature of networks, a threat to one network is a threat to all. This is not a partisan issue, and it impacts Americans in red and blue states alike. Funding has bipartisan support in Congress and at the FCC. I am encouraged by and deeply appreciative of recent legislative developments towards meeting this critical moment and providing the desperately needed funding in the pending NDAA. I want to thank new senators, representatives, and staff, especially on this committee, for the steadfast work to arrive at this point. CCA urges Congress to swiftly pass this important legislation and send it to the President for enactment. Beyond rip and replace, there are other ways Congress can bolster national security and remove barriers and uncertainty. Our carriers truly need federal partners in the fight with us, and they need access to information and resources required to stay ahead of the seemingly never-ending game of security whack-a-mole. Information sharing should facilitate collaboration not only between federal partners and carriers, but also among carriers. Policymakers must also take steps to ensure security requirements are clear and consistent across the federal government. Today, there are many different standards and requirements that carriers must consider, with new layers constantly being added. We need centralized authority and guidance. Small carriers face specific challenges. Beyond having smaller teams with a potential lack of security clearances, many smaller carriers rely on their vendor partners for aspects of security hygiene, monitoring, and response. These carriers do not have the buying power to demand specific security procedures and rely on broader economies of scale and industry investment to support these efforts. Finally, federally policymakers should continue to encourage and invest in new solutions, including research, development, and growth of Open RAN technologies and continued support for trusted vendors. There are other key policy issues Congress should prepare for consideration in the upcoming Congress that are necessary to preserve and expand connectivity, each with aspects impacted by security issues, including defending and reforming the Universal Service Fund, supporting permitting reform, and restoring FCC auction authority. CCA is committed to working with all stakeholders to accomplish the challenging task of securing U.S. networks while maintaining communication services for millions in rural America. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Tim. Senator Moran, you're recognized for our next introduction.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to welcome and thank Dr. James Melvinen for joining us today at this hearing. Dr. Melvinen is an international expert on Chinese cyber warfare, on espionage and military issues. A Chinese linguist by training, he holds a BA from the China Studies from the University of Michigan and a PhD in political science from UCLA. I appreciate his willingness to share his insights and expertise with the committee. Thank you.
Dr. Melvinen, you're recognized for
Subcommittee Chairman Lujan, Ranking Member Moran, and Ranking Member Cruz, thank you for inviting me here today. As Senator Moran said in his introduction, I am a Chinese linguist. I always start with that because it was so damn hard and it took so long and it destroyed my eyesight. But I've spent the last 30 years here in DC building teams of cleared linguist analysts supporting the Department of Defense and the intelligence community and federal law enforcement, and the through line through all of that has been a focus on Chinese cyber and technology issues, which we've been looking at since the mid-1990s. Having looked at all of those attacks over the years, I will say that the Salt Typhoon intrusions are the most serious intrusion against the U.S. telecommunications network that I've seen in my career, and raises a number of troubling strategic and operational and legal issues that I think fall under the purview of this committee to consider. I'd like to make three quick points. The first is the United States clearly is still in a very deep cyber deterrence hole with respect to China, and the hole appears to only be getting deeper. It is clear from recent events that China, and frankly for that measure Moscow and Tehran, don't feel like they found America's pain point yet when it comes to cyber in terms of an expected imposed cost or expected actions on the part of the U.S. government. According to people in this field, deterrence basically comes in two forms: deterrence through denial and deterrence through punishment. The problem with cyber warfare and with networks is deterrence through denial is almost impossible because of the nature of the network itself. The offense only has to find one way to get in, the defender has to find every way to keep them out. That really only leaves deterrence through punishment, which is through response, whether in the cyber realm or in other elements of U.S. national power, responding to the intrusion or the attack in a way that changes the attacker's calculus about doing it again. I will say in the first Trump administration, the promulgation of NSPM 13 went a long way to lowering the thresholds for authorization of offensive action and also a bias towards action. And I expect that in the incoming administration, we're likely to see a similar new bias towards offense as a way of pushing back. The second concern has to do with the operational implications for federal wiretapping and collection by Salt Typhoon. According to public reports, the Chinese gained access to the systems used by the carriers to comply with CALEA and with FISA Section 702 for wiretapping. And as the committee is familiar, Section 105 of CALEA maintains that the carriers have to maintain the security and integrity of those collection requests, which have clearly been violated in this case. It is important historically to note that this is not the first time that we've had this concern about China. In fact, in 2009, the so-called Google Aurora campaign by Chinese hackers also breached a number of these wiretapping compliance databases. So while this isn't the first time this has happened, it's certainly a pattern. And they certainly, again, from a deterrence failure perspective, don't see any prohibition against doing this because of the lack of reaction the first time. Public reports also suggest that the Chinese intruders used a vulnerability in the existing infrastructure hardware that cannot be remediated and would require a generational upgrade of equipment, costing billions of dollars. I think that CALEA, as well as these infrastructure upgrade concerns, should be a primary focus of the committee's oversight and regulatory activity. And I would only point out that the FCC's recent announcement of their draft declaratory ruling that would require communication service providers to submit an annual certification to the FCC attesting that they've created, updated, and implemented a cybersecurity risk management plan does not seem to me to be proactive enough given the seriousness of the intrusion. And then finally, I would go against my Irish heritage and try and find something optimistic to talk about within this context, which is that the rip and replace of the vulnerable hardware exposed by Salt Typhoon could in fact be a huge boon for U.S. telecommunications equipment manufacturers that frankly have struggled over the last decade because of Huawei and ZTE. And that this massive overhaul would in fact be exactly the kind of reshoring and kind of U.S. industrial planning and modernization that frankly we've been trying to achieve over the last 5 or 6 years in our rebalanced relationship with the Chinese economy. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Appreciate that very much. Ranking Member Cruz, Senator Cruz will be recognized for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing, and thank you for the witnesses for being here today. Cyber attacks from state-sponsored hackers represent a grave threat. These attacks strike at the health of our economy, undermine the functioning of our government and security, and cost our nation billions of dollars. State-backed hackers, especially those from the People's Republic of China, Russia, and Iran, are well-funded, highly sophisticated, and relentless in their exploits. No company could hold such a state aggressor at bay indefinitely once it is determined to attack. These attacks have become all too frequent. The latest one, the so-called Salt Typhoon, was a group of hackers reportedly linked to China's Ministry of State Security, who embedded in our telecommunications infrastructure and remained undetected, monitoring America's communications networks. Based on public information, these Chinese hackers reportedly used backdoor channels to access sensitive government information about the integrity of their Chinese spy network operating in the United States. These hackers also accessed American citizens' unencrypted texts, audio calls, and potentially emails from around the country, and specifically targeted our nation's leaders, including President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Vance. There is still much unknown about the Salt Typhoon attack, and details continue to emerge. What is clear is that it was a significant cybersecurity breach with far-reaching implications for both the U.S. government and the public. This incident underscores the persistent and malicious interference by the Chinese Communist Party, a belligerent state actor with a long history of exploiting cyber and telecom avenues to harm U.S. interests. This attack from a state actor against our nation's infrastructure will not be the last. We must plug any vulnerabilities in communications networks. We already have in place a regime of cybersecurity authorities across multiple government agencies. Now is the time to review and align these so they work robustly and efficiently to ensure that our nation's cybersecurity is as strong as it can be. This, however, is only a start. For too long, the Biden-Harris administration has tolerated cyber attacks from the People's Republic of China and others, while using these as a pretext to expand inefficient and redundant government regulations of, at best, dubious efficacy. In the wake of this attack, we may hear more Pavlovian advocacy in this vein today. In fact, just last week, the Biden FCC announced a declaratory ruling and proposed rulemaking to impose, quote, a modern framework to help companies. The press release is quite short on details, but this seems to be a Band-Aid at best and a concealment of a serious blind spot at worst. I have my doubts over whether an annual certification is the right solution, as well as questions about the FCC's technical expertise and legal authority on this matter. The FCC should not be using the waning days of this administration to rush into regulatory expansion. Rather, the agency should be assisting cyber and national security experts in the executive branch to gather and disseminate the information in the public that the public and policymakers will need to fully address the issue in the next administration. As I have noted before, the federal government has a poor track record of protecting against cyber attacks, and we should be cautious about placing too much faith in more regulation and reporting requirements to protect us. Redundant regulations and reporting requirements stifle investment and can weaken incentives to promote secure communications networks and to cooperate with federal authorities. In addition to plugging any holes, we should look at coordinating the cybersecurity tools we already have in place at DHS, at the Department of Justice, and elsewhere. Where these conflict or overlap, I believe we should streamline and remove any chinks in the armor. But rather than finger pointing and punishment, we should be working constructively and asking what incentive structures could be implemented to make our cybersecurity defenses as strong as possible. Finally, the Biden-Harris administration's lack of an effective response to the PRC's brazenness only emboldens our adversaries to push the boundaries further. One of my Senate colleagues called this, quote, the worst telecom hack in our nation's history. If we continue the current administration's approach of weakness and dubious knee-jerk self-regulation, we may have to reply to that colleague, yes, until the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Now, the providers that the Competitive Carriers Association represents are the smallest, most rural providers across the country. Thousands of Americans, but thousands of the most vital community institutions. As I stated earlier, schools, library, hospitals, community centers, even our 911 systems. Mr. Donovan, when there is a vulnerability at one place in one provider's network, how does that affect the rest of the network and the customers that rely on it?
Thank you for the question. Because of the interconnected nature, a vulnerability with one truly is a vulnerability for all. If the network is breached, they can use that position to look at interconnection points, to monitor traffic patterns, to test out different attacks, and to use that as a launching point to attack other networks. It is a major problem there. It also includes into data roaming, where customers may roam onto another network and then back onto their home network. These are some significant problems, and so we do need to remove the vulnerability threats for all carriers.
I appreciate that. Mr. Sherman, can you put the map displayed behind me into context? How do weak security standards in the construction of an undersea cable out in San Francisco or New York can impact institutions in New Mexico and the data that they protect?
Well, first you hit the nail on the head, right? We have these cables taking all kinds of data into and out of the country. So whether you're in Texas or New York or New Mexico or anywhere else, right, these cables are really central. I think the key two words are supply chain, right? Because we could worry about, for example, Huawei supplying the actual physical component, right, of a cable. We could worry about a bad actor repairing the cable and messing with it, right, when it's pulled up from the bottom of the ocean. And so the key is to make sure that across each part of the supply chain, we have the right standards in place, companies are following best practices, and we have groups like Team Telecom saying, here are the extra national security risks we have to watch.
Well, I want to thank you both for those responses. Now, our networks are highly interconnected, and I appreciate the emphasis that both of you placed on that. A vulnerability at any point impacts all of us, and that's why it's important that we use tools at our disposal to fight attempts by foreign threat actors to find ways into our network. Now, as I said in my opening statement, I'm very concerned by the Salt Typhoon hacks and am dedicated to getting to the bottom of how it happened and preventing an intrusion of this magnitude from ever happening again. On December 3rd, the FBI, CISA, and international partners released a guide on what cybersecurity practices telecommunication companies should have in place to resist attacks like Salt Typhoon. Mr. Sherman, reviewing this list, is this brand new information? And are these novel recommendations that the largest companies would not have heard before the U.S. national security agencies?
Certainly not. And as my fellow witness noted, maybe that's different, right, for a smaller carrier or medium-sized business. But nothing in there like use encryption, use multi-factor, don't do a weak password, right? That's not news to a large carrier, right? That's not news to a large company. So I think the real problem it underscores, as you're saying, is that this guidance is not new, yet companies are still not implementing these basics to try and raise the floor of cybersecurity practices.
So just to make sure that I understand, Mr. Sherman, most of the practices that the FBI and CISA are recommending are the things that large companies wouldn't know that they should already be doing.
That's my interpretation, yes.
Dr. Mulvadan, yes or no? Are there things companies could do today to strengthen their networks and resist cyber attacks in the future?
Yes, there are, Senator. I would only point out that the CISA guidance that you're citing, if you read between the lines, if you've read a lot of these, do more monitoring, review your best practices list. It doesn't have any specific remediations that you've seen in other guidance where where you can actually fix the vulnerability. Previous guidance from the Five Eyes partners and the FBI and NSA have actually provided the specific patches that would allow you to fix the vulnerability. The fact that they only call for monitoring and for better encryption and better multi-factor, actually, if you read between those lines, now you understand that the vulnerability is not fixable, that it's a hardware vulnerability that requires a generational equipment shift. And so I think that was one of the most important things that could be revealed here. Now, defense is, of course, always very good. But 15 years ago, the Department of Defense finally came to the conclusion that said simply concentrating on perimeter defense, buying a better firewall, using VPNs and things along those lines was actually not going to be effective because of the advantage that the offense has in cyber warfare and in cyber espionage. Again, as I said before, they only have to find one way to get in. You have to find every way to stop them. As a result, the Department of Defense began implementing what they called defense in depth, which began with a very wise assumption, which is we should assume that all of the hardware and software in our infrastructure is either compromised or potentially compromised, but we need to nonetheless operate. And they began using a lot of very sophisticated techniques like VPNs and secure virtual machines and other things. So it didn't matter if the physical box in the rack was compromised because you could nonetheless operate securely within the machine. But again, it was based on the assumption that in this modern day, you can't ever believe that you don't have compromised hardware and software. So my only point is there's a limit to defense. And that's why deterrence through punishment really is the only thing that we have left to us, because we can't do deterrence through denial to deny them access to the target that they're going after.
I appreciate your answer. So should companies save money and not do any cybersecurity?
No, sir. In fact,
just so that I'm clear.
No, I understand.
That. So I'm going to move on because I don't want us to lose track that these investments are critically important.
Yes.
And they should not be ignored. I very much understand using multiple tools.
Right.
But having a hardened system for water, electricity, for someone that you purchase a package from, that it delivers at the point, from A to B, are absolutely necessary. I just don't want to lose sight of that. Now, Dr. Lewis, you noted in your testimony that while major banks spend 6 to 12% of their IT budgets on cybersecurity, major telecommunication company providers spend only 3 to 5%. What do you believe is the reason for the discrepancy, and how do these companies need to, where do these companies, and how should these companies be investing more?
Thank you. The first answer, of course, is that banks have more money, and so they can spend more. Second answer is that telecom companies are in one of those generational changes as they move to 5G. They're spending a lot on new infrastructure, and they have a different market. I mean, if your cell phone doesn't work, you switch carriers, so the margin for error is much smaller. So the telcos try hard, but they're just in a worse competitive position than the banks when it comes to this. I should note I talked to a senior executive at one of the big banks, and he said, look, there's really no difference. We are an internet company now. So what the banks could do, the telcos could do. And perhaps to Senator Cruz's point, one of the reasons people believe the banks do better is they are more closely regulated by the financial authorities.
Appreciate that, sir. Senator Moran, you're recognized for your questions.
I'll yield to
Senator Cruz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Moran. Dr. Mulvenon, let's start with you. You state in your testimony that, quote, the United States is currently in a deep deterrence hole with respect to China. Based on what you know about Salt Typhoon, as well as your extended knowledge of other state-based attacks on U.S. networks more broadly, is the problem we're facing one of insufficient regulation of domestic companies, or are there broader issues at play?
I really do believe, Senator, that it has to do with the strategic dynamic between Washington and Beijing, and that the carriers are really collateral damage in the discussion. It really has to do with a basic breakdown of deterrence stability that we have with the Chinese on a whole range of strategic topics, including space, nuclear weapons, and cyber. And it really has to do with the issue that the Chinese, at least in cyber, don't actually believe that they found our pain point yet, because they haven't elicited a response from us that would suggest that they found our pain point.
So what would provide meaningful deterrence?
Well, meaningful deterrence can really only be achieved through imposing costs, rather than simply building better defenses, which, as I've tried to point out, is more difficult. To Senator Lujan's comment, however, I would say that the most powerful weapon in the U.S. government's arsenal is not the Trident D5 nuclear missile on the Ohio-class submarine. It's actually the federal acquisition regulations. Because to the extent to which the federal acquisition regulations combined with better NIST standards for telecom security, the U.S. government is one of the largest consumers of telecommunications equipment in the United States. And through the federal acquisition regulation, can simply raise the floor on the cybersecurity quality of the hardware going into the infrastructure.
So should the federal government do that, and what precisely would that look like?
It has been going on for the last couple of years, but going on very slowly. NIST has been very slowly raising the standard, and I would only highlight as a defense contractor that the defense industrial base is held to a much higher standard than non-defense contractors in the United States. And we actually have to adhere to a much higher level of cybersecurity standard for our networks. And the way that the U.S. government, in fact, enforces that higher level of standard is through the defense federal acquisition regulations. In other words, if we want to stay in business, we've got to fix the cybersecurity. But in terms of our dynamic with Beijing, That is really beyond the purview of the companies, for the same reason you said in your opening statement, which is no commercial company is able to withstand the dedicated activity of a state cyber actor. And thus, really, cyber deterrence comes down to a response policy by Cyber Command and the other elements of the U.S. government in terms of imposing costs on the Chinese side such that it changes their calculus of the expected value of future attacks and intrusions.
So, Dr. Lewis, you state in your testimony that countering China requires, quote, a sustained, direct, and more forceful effort to disincentivize the Chinese. In your judgment, what can a future Trump administration do to curb the incentives of the Chinese to engage in these types of deeply troubling behaviors?
Thank you, Senator. I'm hopeful that the incoming administration will do this, but you need a two-part strategy. First, you need to engage with the Chinese regularly, the way we had arms control talks with the Soviets on nuclear weapons. You need to start by telling the Chinese, this is unacceptable, you've gone too far, and if you don't stop, we're going to take action. Now, they aren't going to stop, right? That's just, why would they believe us? So the next step is to actually do something, and this would be where Cyber Command or NSA probably needs to develop a menu of responses, not the top end, but something a little lower down, probably going after their attack infrastructure in cyberspace, and then go back to the Chinese and say, we weren't kidding, now do you want to talk? The Chinese aren't that interested in making a deal with us. I was there in September and they basically said, you're on a downhill path, why should we deal with you now? So I think the first step is to engage, warn them, and then take action.
Dr. Baldwin, you also state in your testimony that the FCC's recent announcement of plans to require communication providers to submit certification that they have implemented a cybersecurity risk management plan is, quote, not nearly proactive enough. Are you concerned that the FCC might be so focused on doing something that it risks creating policies that merely appear effective without addressing the core of the problem?
Well, to be fair, it could have been worse. They could have called for a blue ribbon commission. But the FCC has direct regulatory oversight, particularly over CALEA compliance. And in the past, when CALEA was expanded to include broadband and VoIP, those were led by orders from FCC. So what I expected to see in their press release was a specific discussion of CALEA compliance and wiretapping compliance and certification from the carriers that they were engaged in fixing the problem right now. Not some airy-fairy sort of annual certification, but that they were actually going to submit something within 90 days that actually described how they were going to actually remediate the specific vulnerability that caused Salt Typhoon in the first place. And I was surprised to not see it.
So a final question to anyone on the panel who wishes to answer it. What should the American people know about Salt Typhoon, about what happened, and about the security of their communications?
So I'll share that American users know that our communications network has been attacked. That the carriers are doing their best to provide service. There are things that consumers can do. RCS, rich communication services for text messages, is encrypted end to end. If you use those services, then there's ways that even if somebody is watching the network, they cannot see what the traffic is. There are steps that consumers can also take to increase their security, and our carriers are trying to work to educate them on those while we're also working to kick the attackers out of the networks.
Thank you, Senator. I guess the first thing I'd say is that they should know that we're losing, right? So we're not on the winning side of the scoreboard here in the telecommunications and cyber espionage battle. The second thing they need to know is their services that they depend on, whether it's delivery from a company or the phone or the electricity, are all at risk and are all potentially being held hostage by a hostile foreign power. That makes me nervous.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cruz. Senator Hickenlooper, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank each of you for coming here. We know how busy you are as well. This hearing today is obviously very timely. Salt Typhoon, as we've been discussing, pretty much everyone, is one of the most devastating cyber attacks in the country's history. It's a sobering reminder for all of us of how critical it is to make sure that our infrastructure is resilient to all types of threats from all types of adversaries. Certain threats, like relying on equipment manufactured in China by Huawei or ZTE, has been known for years. This technology leaves Americans vulnerable to spying, data being stolen, marketed. When it was first created in 2019, the FCC's Rip and Replace program was designed to remove suspect Chinese network equipment from wide swaths of the U.S. networks. But the program is currently impacted by a $3 billion shortfall, leaving wireless networks vulnerable to espionage, disruption, forms of terrorism. There are thousands of wireless towers, often in rural areas, with dangerous equipment still hanging from them to this day. And behind me, you're going to see the just how devastating Rip and Replace program's lack of funding is to Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, and to a lesser extent to many other states. Many of these are rural carriers, small businesses that have not been reimbursed for the cost of replacing this equipment for multiple years. We're delighted that the bipartisan fiscal bill of 2025 National Defense Authorization Act will finally include a solution to fully fund the Rip and Replace program. The success of Rip and Replace will ensure wireless communications across rural America can continue without disruption or interruption. Grateful to both Republicans and Democrats in this bipartisan effort, and the FCC who worked with us to achieve this goal to protect the impacted communities. Let me ask a couple questions. Mr. Lewis, when NTIA hosted the inaugural International Open RAN Symposium this year in Golden, Colorado, I'm forced to mention, it's a short drive from the NTIA's Institute for Telecommunication Sciences in Boulder. The symposium brought together experts from over 20 countries to advance security and reliability, make sure we have the successful adoption of Open RAN technology. Mr. Lewis, how would open and interoperable technologies like Open RAN help enhance the supply chain and address security concerns that have impacted the traditional networks?
Thank you, Senator. One of the things that happened over the last 20 years is that all of the American telecom companies were driven out of business, largely because of Huawei's advantages from the mothership. Open RAN has the opportunity to change that, and that's a real plus. It will not immediately guarantee better security. It will change the security problem. Open RAN is more like the internet than the traditional telecom stack. That means it'll have the same cybersecurity problems we know the internet faces, which are different. But on the whole, by getting China out of our supply chain, by finding ways to create new technologies, I think we'll be better off. So that's the promise of Open RAN. Just a final thing, I meet with a lot of phone companies, and I used to ask them, what do you think of Open RAN? And until this year, all of them said, we're not going to use it, it's not reliable. That started to change.
Good. Mr. Sherman, the Office of National Cyber Director published a request for information last year to continue harmonizing the various cybersecurity regulations across the entire federal government. They heard from stakeholders, including telecom companies. They heard that regulations should be flexible and voluntary so that companies can innovate and respond to evolving, sophisticated threats. In addition to innovating, we should be doing more to improve our cyber basics, including adopting well-known best practices, patching devices, making sure that we have improving the access controls. Had these been in place across our critical infrastructure, we could have prevented many recent cyber attacks that compromised both our customers and our national security. Mr. Sherman, to continue improving our cyber defenses, how should we determine the right scope of mandatory cybersecurity, and where should the federal government stick to the flexible, voluntary compliance that what they obviously prefer, but it's not always in the best interest of the country?
Yeah, I think two things, right? One, as you said, is scoping which systems are we talking about, right? And for years, we've identified what those critical infrastructure systems are. Water treatment, energy. Obviously, today we're talking about telecommunications, subsea cables. So I think as you're saying, the first part is which are the sectors, everything can be attacked, but where are the sectors where attacks, breaches, compromises are the most damaging for the American people and for national security? The second piece, as you said, is what are those basics? So certainly telling the small carrier, I'm sure, to do 7,000 things is not useful or productive, right? But large companies that still don't have multi-factor authentication, that is a terrible security practice, right? So we need to identify what are those basics. You mentioned some of them, encryption, others. Make sure that for those critical infrastructure sectors, organizations, right, they're aware of what to do and they're actually doing it.
Yeah, and that's a required part. I agree. All right, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Moran, you recognize your question.
Chairman, thank you. Maybe this is to Dr. Lewis. Let me start there. So the information that China gathers from this most recent episode and the information they can continue to gather, what's its value to China?
Thank you, Senator. That's a great question. It's worth bearing in mind that the Chinese government is paranoid and composed entirely of control freaks. So some of the information they steal, it's not clear why they take it. The intellectual property that lets them design new products, like in the telecom sector, that makes sense. Traditional political military espionage, what our war plans are, what our capabilities are, that makes sense. But some of the personal data they take really doesn't make sense. Now, they do it at home because they're afraid of their own population, but they do it to us too. The downside to this is we don't want to wake up one day and find out that the Chinese have figured out how to use the personal data they've been collecting on Americans. Heavens knows they're trying to figure out what the benefit could be.
Is there a benefit just of distraction, expense? The United States is taking its eye off other balls while we address this issue?
I don't think so. I think it's a crucial part, and I think all my fellows would agree with me. It's a crucial part of China's plan to overcome the United States.
That's useful for Americans to hear too, what you just said. In our unwillingness to respond in deterrence, looking the other way in a sense, is it expensive, lack of will? It seems to me that we've learned in other Cold Wars that you respond to your adversary's actions and you respond in a way that diminishes those actions in the future. I appreciated your suggestion that there be negotiations or conversations that precede that, but if we're going to have any chance of success in combating these continual attacks, it's got to be a dramatic and real consequence to China, right?
No, that's absolutely correct. The Chinese, part of, and I think my colleagues would agree, part of deterrence is you have to be credible. You have to make credible threats. And since probably about 2010, other countries have concluded that our threats aren't credible.
And are there other countries where the threat is responded to, or the actions are responded to, and there's a consequence of less? Who else besides the United States is in the crosshairs of China?
All NATO members, Japan, Korea, Singapore, the Philippines.
Do others do it better than we do?
They are in the crosshairs of the Chinese. None of them do it in part because they're looking to us for a signal. They're looking for us to lead.
Mr. Olvenin, something you want to say add to that?
No, what I would say is that historically, when I've spoken with previous administrations about response options, the caution has always been the situation is asymmetrical. The domain is asymmetrical. The United States is asymmetrically vulnerable because we're a more digital wired society. Therefore, we have more to lose. Therefore, we shouldn't respond. My response to that has always been, but over time, the Chinese economy, the Chinese population, key elements of the Chinese digital infrastructure have in fact become much more modernized. And I would argue that we have achieved a relative level of symmetry where that asymmetry argument really doesn't hold any water for me anymore. To be honest, I've over the years burned my own hole in the ozone layer driving up to Central Maryland, trying to talk to people about ranges of response options. even when we had very clear understanding of who had done it and why, and even with a discussion about the whole range of U.S. national power, not simply tit for tat in cyber. And as I pointed out during the first Trump administration, the lowering of the authorization threshold under NSPM 13 actually resulted in greater activity, response activity. And one thing I would highlight, for instance, as a success was the attack against the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, which we knew had been responsible for some level of election interference. And there is a school of thought that said there was less election interference originating from that type of organization in the subsequent election because we had imposed cost on the Internet Research Agency.
Do we have the capability of responding?
We do have the capability of responding across a whole variety of measures, including cyber. And so it isn't a capabilities discussion. It is absolutely a political will and national command authority decision-making discussion.
And finally, would we know if we'd responded? I've often wondered if we have responded to Chinese attacks, cyber attacks on the United States, and China would never report that we had responded to those attacks.
Well, to be honest, sir, I don't think that that's the metric of success. In many ways, if we want the Chinese to de-escalate, something that they see and understand the consequences of, but doesn't create a public situation where they feel reputational shame, where they then have to respond again, probably is the best outcome.
You took that differently than I'd intended, but my point was that I'd feel better if we were responding as compared to waiting, but we just didn't know that we'd responded because the Chinese never made an issue of it. I just wanted to make sure that there's not a fact out there that I don't know or that we don't know about something we're doing.
I would turn the logic upside down and say deductively, again, in an open hearing, deductively, you could conclude from the increasing severity of the Chinese intrusions and attacks that we have not, in fact, previously imposed costs on them that has changed their cost-benefit calculus.
Thank you for reminding a member of the United States Senate about logic.
No, sir.
Senator Peters, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. You know, each of your testimonies touched on the threat posed by to our national security and to our rural broadband by the Chinese telecommunication firms Huawei and ZTE. And that's why I was proud to have joined many others in successfully fighting for funding to close the RIP and replace shortfall in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, which we expect to become law in just a matter of a few weeks here. As I've said before, we shouldn't make rural communities choose between being fully connected and having their connections compromised by our adversaries. This is actually particularly big news back in Michigan, and specifically for Northern Michigan University, which provides internet to 7,400 students and over 16,000 families in the Upper Peninsula. And for the first time in years, they're going to now be able to upgrade and expand their service. So, Mr. Donovan, my question is for you, sir. How significant is this funding for a provider like Northern Michigan University? And how do networks like theirs in the Upper Peninsula, a very rural area, work to drive more activity around rural broadband that otherwise would probably simply not even be feasible?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your support and push to get this program funded over the years. And I join you in my optimism that it will get across the goal line in the coming weeks, and just really appreciate all your efforts on that. It's absolutely essential for these companies. They have been frozen for the last 5 years, unable to patch, unable to upgrade, unable to buy spare parts. This allows them to complete the rip and replace build and then move forward. The effect is life-changing in communities like the areas that they serve, because simply no one else is going to go there. The economies being what they are, of the sparse populations in the terrain that they serve, is incredibly hard to make a business case to build it out. They're doing it because it's part of their mission to connect their community. And I want to make clear also that let's not confuse small operators with being unsophisticated. These are operating state-of-the-art networks. They are doing this. The biggest challenge is the information asymmetry that they have, where you get a guidance of, update your passwords, have these right things in place, but it's not actionable. We need a little bit more of, look here, go do this. Give the carrier something so that when the intelligence committee is aware of threats, that the small carriers and all carriers can take the steps that are necessary with clear guidance.
Yeah, Very good. Mr. Lewis, one of my top priorities as a member of this committee, as well as chair of Homeland Security and Government Affairs, is protecting American consumers and companies from the national security and economic threat posed by Chinese connected vehicles on our roads. That's why I pushed the Commerce Department to publish its proposed rule to block the import and sale of Chinese-controlled connected vehicles here in the United States, and even if they're manufactured in countries like Mexico. Mr. Lewis, you have raised concerns in the past about the Chinese government's goal of using dominance in connected and automated vehicle technology to exploit the national security of our country. So, sir, could you please discuss the national security risk associated with Chinese infiltration and control of the data sharing infrastructure modern vehicles operate, and the importance of U.S. leadership and innovation in this space if we hope to prevent these vulnerabilities from occurring?
Thank you, Senator, and thanks for your work on this, because it's an issue that is often ignored. But we all know, or we all should know, that by now your car is a rolling computer, and that most cars, certainly those built in the last few years, connect to the telecommunications network through a module. The biggest makers of those modules are Chinese. It's a worrisome problem for the car makers, because if you stop buying from those Chinese companies, you won't be able to have a connected car. And I've talked with both European and American car manufacturers about the dilemmas of moving this out. What can they do? Well, first of all, they know where you are, right? The car is transmitting a signal. It gives away your location. You can think of scenarios where that location data would be useful. Second, it gives you the ability to perhaps interfere with the performance of the car. We don't want to go all Hollywood and have people turning cars off in mid-flight or whatever, but it is a risk that your performance could be interfered with in a crisis, for example. Again, you can think of scenarios. So we have found ourselves in a situation, not just in this, but with others, where we went for the lowest cost supplier. We thought the Chinese were going to be friends. They are embedded throughout our infrastructure, and it will be hard to get them out. Cars are a leading example of this, though, because the modules that come from China, the updates, the patching, all that creates opportunity for mischief.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Budd, you're recognized for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and thank the panel. This is truly fascinating. You know, public reporting around the Salt Typhoon hack, it's deeply concerning and speaks to the massive scale of Chinese efforts to infiltrate America's telecommunications infrastructure. Today's testimony referenced the mismatch between the scope of the threat and the ability to harden networks, incredibly deter malign state actors like China from trying again. China's heavy subsidies and commercial espionage for Huawei and ZTE have helped make them global leaders in deployed networks. I'm pleased to see that the National Defense Authorization Act, which my colleague mentioned just a moment ago, that included funding to finally complete the rip and replace of this compromised technology in the U.S. networks. So, Dr. Mulvinen, what else could the U.S. be doing to combat the global dominance of Chinese hardware providers?
So the thing is we discussed Open RAN earlier. There's a number of interesting dynamics, particularly in 5G, when we decided to adopt a plurilateral strategy where we decided to work with our OECD allies in Europe and Japan and South Korea. We confronted a number of dilemmas. One is that even if we don't buy Huawei equipment, that because of the Huawei's involvement in the standard setting for 5G, that they actually get 40% of the royalties for the patents from 5G. So even non-Huawei companies that sell 5G equipment, Huawei is still financially benefiting under the 3GPP standard setting process. Open RAN gave us an opportunity to get out of that trap and in fact be the basis for cooperation among OECD partners in an open source way that would not get bogged down in particular royalties and particular patents. It was also important in that case to break down any antitrust barriers that might exist between, for instance, Nokia and Ericsson in Europe and Juniper and Cisco in the United States that would prevent them from working together to actually build a coherent end-to-end handset to base station to servers offering of an alternative to 5G as an alternative to Huawei and ZTE for the global south, for Africa, for South America, for Southeast Asia. Because for a long time, there was no Western company that actually offered an end-to-end offering that could compete with Huawei's. And so the things that we were doing in Open RAN and the things we were doing in those plurilateral frameworks, I think, strengthened our ability to not only push back against Huawei's global dominance, which had national security implications, but it also allowed us to strengthen our own companies to be able to compete on a relatively level playing field.
5G has been talked about for years. I mean, from here to the dinner table, but we're only recently hearing, at least in these settings, about Open RAN. Why the disconnect there?
Well, I mean, the carriers were right for a number of years that Open RAN wasn't as robust to be able to handle tier 1 level traffic as the current standards were. But that's why we invested so much money in Open RAN, was to help it catch up so that in fact the carriers wouldn't resist it by saying it's actually going to reduce our performance in terms of providing telecommunication service. So Open RAN had a lot of work to do, but I would argue, and agreeing with Dr. Lewis, that in fact Open RAN is much more mature and robust right now and is a credible alternative for the carriers. There's a lot of benefits to going to open source, by the way, as opposed to a closed source patent and royalty environment in which clearly Huawei is financially benefiting.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan, I wanted to briefly ask you, you mentioned that it's difficult for smaller providers to navigate these complex cybersecurity requirements from all these different agencies that sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't align with each other. Should this committee look at addressing streamlined cybersecurity requirements, and how can we encourage private sector investment in cybersecurity?
Yes, sir. That certainly would help by having some coordinated approach and making sure that you are taking information collection regulations requirements that are already in place and using those as much to build on them into the cyber instead of creating new frameworks that make it even more challenging for smaller operators in particular to navigate.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Senator Welch, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses. It's very helpful. There's a couple of things that come to mind as I'm listening. Obviously, if China infiltrates, their national security risk, there's infrastructure risk, there's company security risk, and then potentially individuals. Mr. Lewis, you said that there's not any, you don't know why, or China doesn't even know why they might try to get individual consumer information or citizen information. Is there evidence that they're trying to do that specifically?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Unfortunately, there is.
So why would they want somebody's information in Norwich, Vermont, let's say? And what information is it that they'd be going after?
Well, you could improve your intelligence analysis. You could better identify targets for some sort of covert action.
I don't get that. I mean, that sounds like it's specific. I mean, if you randomly get somebody, like you throw a dart at the old phone book and you get a name, and you come up with some information, how's that going to help you do anything?
Because the technology allows it. Because the same way that Amazon or Google can track tens of millions of people and say, this is what they want for Christmas, this is what they want for, in their stocking, that is something that the Chinese are able to do. So they're looking for political benefit.
All right. So how do we deal with this? There's always going to be an effort to infiltrate, right, by adversaries, and China is very aggressive, and you've talked about that. But what's the best way to deal with that, and who bears the burden? I mean, the big telecom companies are the ones that have the systems in place.
Thank you.
As opposed to a small individual consumer.
I think one of the things that we've all said is that this requires a national response to change Chinese behavior. That a phone company going to China and saying, please stop they'll just laugh.
Well, that's the deny and deterrence that you were talking about. I get that. So there'd be a national response if we're going to try to punish China or another adversary by infecting their systems. But what's the deterrence? What's the deny? I mean, who's responsible to set up a denial system?
Well, there are a couple things you can do, and this administration has made some progress, and it's probable that the next administration will continue it. Here's a good example. When this last transition occurred, there was a company called SolarWinds that was hacked. One of the targets now is go for the third-party service providers, because you hack once and you get hundreds of targets. SolarWinds had a password for their updater. It was SolarWinds 123, right? That's not going to stymie the Chinese or the Russians for very long. You had the OPM hack, where 17 million Americans, including I think some of us on this panel, had our information taken.
Let me go to Mr. Sherman. I was going to go, you and then Mr. Mulder.
I think it's two things, right? As we're saying, we have to identify where are companies not following best practices. How do we require to raise the floor? Again, I don't think we should be writing 8,000, bullet points down and putting it in a law that doesn't change, but we can't keep doing this voluntary business anymore where companies don't have any requirements in critical infrastructure sectors. And some they do, right? But where they don't, we can't do this voluntary thing anymore.
All right, so how do we hold them accountable, and how do we impose that obligation?
Yeah. As one of my fellow witnesses mentioned, federal contracting is a huge way of getting that language in. You can do ongoing audits in ways that are right. There's tons of technology now, innovative stuff from the private sector to do ongoing auditing anyway. Lots of companies do this. So it's not like you're adding on some massive cost necessarily to go in as the government or somebody and take a look at what those metrics are looking like.
But the burden would be on those companies to do that.
To improve the baseline, absolutely. Yeah.
Mr. Mullen, and you were going to look like you wanted to answer this too, but before you do, one of the huge concerns I have is the things that Mr. Donovan's talking about. I'm from Vermont, rural area, it's small, and there's no way our small companies can bear the regulatory burdens that might be associated with best practices for national security. They just can't do it. And the bottom line then is that people who need access to the internet won't have it. So maybe you can address that, Mr.
I agree with you, Senator. In fact, what we've said from the beginning is even the large carriers, even the tier ones, are not technically capable of withstanding the determined efforts of a state-based cyber actor. And so that shouldn't be the standard. I would push back a little bit on the idea of why the Chinese are gathering this information. The OPM hack, which stole the personal information of everyone in the U.S. government at the time who had a security clearance, combined with the Care First Blue Cross Blue Shield hack, the Anthem hack, the Experian financial data hack, based on what I do for a living, if I had that information about an adversary, I would have a highly precise and detailed understanding that would allow me to do a range of targeting of those individuals. The amount of data that Americans have out in the wild that could then be put together in ways that could be used for recruitment, for disruption of what they're doing. And so if you have all of that data to begin with, and then you have Assault Typhoon, where knowing already all of the personal information necessary to then drill into the tier one provider's customer records to be able to identify who then you want to actually listen to the phone calls of and be able to listen to the voicemails of, that's exactly the intelligence sequence that you would need to be able to do that.
So basically it adds up.
Absolutely.
Okay, I yield back. Thank you.
Can I add one thing, Senator?
Sure.
One of the reasons I think we're all frustrated is that we actually know what to do now. And so between NSA, the Australian Signals Directorate, other partners, we've identified the minimal number of steps that will reduce the effectiveness of most cyber attacks by 80 to 90%. There's something called known exploitable vulnerabilities program that some of the private companies do. We know how to lower the threats considerably. We just aren't doing it.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Blackburn. Senator Blackburn, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here for the the hearing. I appreciate it. Mr. Mulvanon, I want to come to you and let's talk a little bit about what you refer to as the deterrence hole regarding China, noting that deterrence can involve denial and hardening networks, or it can involve punishment, which really relies on that retaliation from credible threats. So you talk about deterrence by punishment maybe being more effective, but we're looking at an increase in these threats and attacks, and you all just touched on that with Senator Welch. So as we look at a new administration coming in, talk to me a little bit about lessons learned. And you're just saying we know how to do this, and that's why it's frustrating. So drill down on that. What can we look at with a cyber deterrent posture? What opportunities would be there for cyber diplomacy and offensive capabilities, and things that would actually discourage our adversaries from trying to carry out the attacks in the first place?
Thank you, Senator. I want to be clear that obviously we should do everything we can on the defensive side to bolster deterrence through denial by not making it easy for the adversary to get in the network. The key issue that I often run into when talking to people about this is a belief that there is a silver bullet out there. There is a technology, there is a US vendor that has a piece of hardware or a piece of software that is the answer, and therefore there are going to be no more intrusions. But unfortunately, the nature of the cyber domain is such that the offense is always outpacing the defense. So my point is, deterrence through denial is impossible to be the only solution. It has to be paired with deterrence through punishment. We have done a lot of deterrence through denial through equipment upgrades and software upgrades. Deterrence through punishment, in the case of China, is not something that we have pursued. We have done it on a limited basis with the Russians. We've done it with lesser powers. We've seen real impact from it. But it is, as you suggest, Senator, a range of things. First and foremost is a declaratory policy that draws a line that you can defend. Now, often our declaratory policy in cyber is something pretty anodyne along the lines of the United States government reserves the right at a time and place of its own choosing to respond to a cyber attack against a U.S. target with the full measure of U.S. national power. It's not that we haven't said it out loud that's the problem. It's that we haven't backed it up. And what that means is when we have attacks like the attack against Sony, the attack against GitHub, the attack, Volt, Flax, and Salt Typhoon, the world is awaiting understanding what our response is going to be and whether we are going to impose costs in any potential realm. What we know doesn't work is naming and shaming. We know that listing the operators and putting them out on an Interpol red notice does not do anything. We know that talking to them about it alone doesn't do anything. One area where we did have frankly, some very positive results was when the Obama administration put out an executive order ascribing cyber sanctions to Chinese state-owned enterprise executives and others that financially benefited from Chinese commercial cyber espionage. Because we were touching people that were actually directly connected to the leadership. I'm a big follow the money guy in that sense. But at the end of the day, there are things we can do in this symmetrical domain where we can actually signal to the Chinese in cyber that we are holding capabilities that they have at risk. We can do it in a gray way that is not publicly visible so that they don't feel that international reputational shame, feel like they have to respond in order to defend national dignity. But they nonetheless will get the message that, in fact, there will be costs in the future if they do something like that again.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Sherman, I have a question for you dealing with the undersea cables and the way the U.S. is relying on foreign repair ships to go in. And of course, we're concerned about the Chinese vessels that are dragging anchors to cut these cables. And and I will let you submit this since I am running out of time, but I would like to get what you think about investing in a subsea cable repair and what we should be doing there in order to make certain that we are protecting the undersea cables. But since I'm out of time, let's submit that one for the record. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Markey, you're recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for having this incredibly important hearing. In 1994, when the House debated the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA, I was the chairman of telecommunications in the House of Representatives. I think Mr. Donovan remembers that. And I took to the House floor to discuss the importance of safeguarding the constitutional and privacy rights of the public in that debate on the House floor. I also pushed on the House floor for clear, comprehensive cybersecurity standards, recognizing that a backdoor into our telecom networks would create an enticing target for hackers domestically and internationally. 30 years later, those privacy risks have become abundantly clear with the Salt Typhoon hack, which Chinese hackers reportedly exploited that backdoor to spy on Americans' phone calls. This hack appears to be the most disastrous and impactful telecommunications hack in our nation's history. As our witnesses and my colleagues have said today, we urgently need to enhance our cybersecurity defenses to ensure a hack of this nature never happens again. Mr. Lewis, you talk in your written testimony about how the FCC should use Section 105 of CALEA to secure our telecommunications systems. Can you elaborate on what the Commission should do under this authority?
Thank you, Senator. As you well know from chairing the committee that drafted CALEA, it had cybersecurity provisions in it, and perhaps they haven't been lived up to as much as we would like.
Yes, and I would have been the one putting those provisions in that bill at that time. So they have not been used. Is that what you're saying?
They're being used incompletely, partially. We could do a better job. That's a good starting point. FCC and other parts of the new administration will need to figure out what to do next on supply chain, on federal acquisitions regulations. But CALEA is a good place to start for the FCC.
Yeah, and why do you think they never acted, the FCC, over the years?
Well, some of it is there's a presumption that the companies are doing the right thing, and in many cases they were. What we have is a very dynamic, well-resourced opponent.
The opponent is?
China.
Right. But we also have a well-resourced telecommunications industry.
Not in comparison, unfortunately, Senator. The Chinese are willing to spend money that the telcos could only dream of to get into their system. So it's a dynamic battle, and what might have worked 5 years ago doesn't work now.
And, well, obviously, what the Chinese had 5 years ago isn't the same as what the Chinese have today. So it's a constant game of spy versus spy. It's like Mad Magazine, right? And if one side stops spending, then the other side gains the advantage. So there obviously has to be some additional spending, which, takes place. And if it's not the companies.
Well, the oversight part is important too, because if you look at the rules in CALEA written so many years ago, they're actually adequate, right? They're written in a way that they could be implemented. And who is making sure that someone is following them? And that's where some of the things that the FCC has proposed now for annual reporting probably is useful.
No, I appreciate that. Interestingly, 4 years ago, as soon as Trump came in, the telecom companies wanted to have a congressional repeal of the privacy laws that had just been passed by the Federal Communications Commission, and all of the Republicans came out and voted to repeal all the privacy laws that were on the books at the behest of the telecommunications companies, which passed. We have nothing right now. So I think it's more complex, to be honest with you. I think the telecom companies could have done a lot more, but they don't want to do anything on children's privacy or on or even these security upgrades. Okay, you just have to spend the money. You're in that business. You just have to accept that that's part of network reliability. So I think the hack does deserve attention, immediate action, and I'm glad the Commission has begun the process to require telecom providers to secure their networks and urge the agency to use the full scope of its authority to protect our communications system. It's not just a vulnerability that comes from the Chinese, but it can come from any other place in the world as well. And ultimately, the private sector just has to have a responsibility to upgrade to protect as the cost of doing business. It's just the way it is. And the same thing is true, by the way, for network climate resilience. You know, we desperately need to improve the resilience against climate of our telecommunication system. So just, if you could, yes or no to each of our witnesses. Do you agree that we must invest additional resources to protect our communications networks against climate change and natural disasters? Yes or no?
Sort of a no-brainer, but I'll say yes.
Okay, good. Mr. Sherman?
Yes.
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 No, thank you. Yeah, it's coming. And there's nothing that's going to stop it. You know, climate deniers are not dealing with the reality of this threat. And it can hit North Carolina. It can cause unbelievable. You know the number from the two storms, Milton and Helene, total damage to the United States, $300 billion in 2 weeks, $300 billion. And that's just a preview of coming atrocities. And it can wipe out telecommunication systems. It can wipe out, you know, anything in its path. And it's just kind of these are baby storms compared to what's going to happen in 5 or 10 more years if we don't deal with climate change. Our whole defense budget is $800 billion. It was $300 billion in 2 weeks, okay? And anything and everything in its path just got completely and totally wiped out. So, Mr. Chairman, I can't tell you how grateful I am for this hearing. And you're saying, Dr. Lewis, they're going to use that inherent authority that we built into the 94 law to finally, you know, so I'm very grateful for that. And did you want to add something, Mr. Donovan? I'm being indulged by the chairman right now. Yes.
I would just add that part of the funding necessary in other programs, you know, well, with the Universal Service Fund, that you simply put, we are under attack on UNSF in the courts right now, and that creates uncertainty that could strip away the funding that allows these companies to even exist, let alone invest in their cybersecurity.
No, I get it. Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chairman Lujan and Ranking Member Moran. This hearing, like everyone said, it is so incredibly important. This is an issue that's fundamental to our national security, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for your work, for being here. And as everyone's been so worried, we're worried about zero trust, right? Because many cybersecurity practices, they span over sectors. Implementing multi-factor authentication, mandatory training on recognizing threats, and not just once a year for a half hour, really trying to reinforce cyber hygiene, data minimization. It's really important. And being sure that we talk about that zero trust architecture where verification is required at every major point of access. And historically, our telephone networks were built assuming that only those with authorized access would be able to get into certain pieces of the network, but of course we know it's no longer the case. So Mr. Donovan, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a two-part question. What dynamics have prevented the telecom industry, especially small providers, from building networks with zero trust approach? And what could Congress and federal agencies do to ensure providers, big and small, are empowered to prioritize securing their network? And that I'm going to ask Mr. Sherman if you have anything to add.
Well, thank you for the question. You know, there's a couple different buckets. One, for the carriers that are going through the rip and replace process, it has been the lack of funding to complete that and to remove this untrusted equipment from their networks. But for all carriers, and to continue what I was mentioning a little bit before, that it's been the lack of the Universal Service Fund to maintain, to continue to allow operating expenses to include cyber. The margins are extraordinarily tight, and we need to have that support to maintain telecommunications service in rural America, just like why the program was created. To the latter point, it really is, it's full on information sharing so that we have an all government approach to help carriers respond to some of these attacks and get ahead of them. Cyber is a scale game, and so we need everyone working together on this.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman, do you have anything to add?
Just two things. One, as we've heard, right, we're not going to stop hacking. That's not going to go away, but we should not be making it easy for people to get into systems. So those baselines, again, are important, and making some of them mandatory are important. The second piece, as we've also been talking about, I think, is know your vendor, know your supplier. It's way too easy, right? These systems are far too interconnected, whether it's subsea cables, mobile telecom networks, healthcare, whatever, right? It's way too interconnected with too many companies, too many parts made in too many different places, that if you're not aware of where those parts are made, have they been tested, who owns it, that's a huge vulnerability space. So, again, we have analogies in other sectors for KYC and banking and other areas. We should be taking those principles and frameworks and applying them to these technology issues.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I actually wrote a little software system of phone trunks many years ago, and so I know a little bit about this. But I want to talk about the funding piece, because this is so important to all of us. And you talk about Universal Service Fund and others, but we think about the E-rate program, and how do we allow schools and libraries to use funding for cybersecurity? We know that they received $5 billion in requests over the first year. We think about how we expand some of those things in the E-rate program. So to all of the witnesses, I know I'm moving off to something a little different. Are there other federal telecom programs that we could expand eligible expenses to cybersecurity? Is it worth establishing a specific program for telecom cybersecurity? Because in my opinion, if simply adding cybersecurity requirements, is that really enough? So Mr. Donovan, we'll start with you. Should we expand, or should we try to create an overarching system that everyone can use?
Sarah, I think you touched on a really important piece of this, that it's one thing to tell the industry, you need to do more, you need to do this, you need to provide these reports. But if there aren't the resources available for those carriers, no matter the best of their intentions, they simply cannot do that. As Senator Welch touched on before, you will drive these companies out of business. We need to make sure that we are resourcing them to address these threats.
Anyone else have anything to add in my last few seconds, thinking about maybe setting some templates that certainly some of our smaller carriers can use that would make them less vulnerable?
There is something we could add, Senator, and it's a good question. We talked about it a little earlier before you joined us, but the federal government is actually the largest single consumer of IT products and services in the United States, and one of the biggest in the world. So changing the federal acquisition regulations to require more secure hardware, more secure software, more secure services would benefit everyone, including some of these smaller institutions that we've been talking about. It's nice because you don't have to choose to sell to the government, but we think that it would create incentives for people to improve their products without adding to the budget woes.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, this hearing overall has been so incredibly helpful. I appreciate it. And thank you again.
Senator Rosen, thank you very much. Senator Klobuchar, you're recognized for your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for this hearing. I'm sorry I had the Capitol Police Chief before us today in the Rules Committee, or I would be there in person. I'm the co-chair of the Next Generation 911 Caucus, and our focus is on ensuring that our emergency communications are secure. Ransomware attacks have taken down 911 systems, as the witnesses know. In August, a cyber attack caused outages to the 911 system in Austin, Texas, and in 2018, Baltimore's 911 dispatch system had to be shut down because of hackers. And of course, many, many other things have been warded off because of good work at the federal, state, and local levels. Mr. Donovan, in your view, what can Congress do to ensure the resiliency of our emergency response systems in the face of a cyber threat, especially in rural areas?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think this is a continuation that these networks are interconnected. The telecommunication services help power emergency services, 911, as we talked about earlier in the hearing, even our automobiles going on. And so it's shoring up those vulnerabilities across the entire ecosystem will inure benefits on emergency services and 911.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, I believe the public and private sector have to work together whenever possible on this. We know oftentimes private sector is on the first line of defense. They pick things up, like the recent Chinese hack with Microsoft. Can you speak to the importance of the federal government and private sector working together to improve cybersecurity, especially for small businesses that have fewer resources than the big ones? We can't have a situation where small businesses get pushed out, shoved away because they don't have the cybersecurity to protect things. And so we're going to need a combined effort on this front. Your testimony notes telecom companies could be investing more in acquiring cybersecurity talent and expanding security teams. Could you talk about this?
Certainly. Thank you, Senator. One of the changes in the last decade or so has been the shift for spending on research and development, on creating new technology, on innovation, from the government agencies to the private sector, to some of the big tech companies, to some of the startups. So the private sector is where the action is on this. And one way to take advantage of that for smaller companies and for smaller institutions is to think about where they can use what are called cloud services. Cloud services is basically you access the resource over the internet, but somebody else is responsible for managing it, for updating it, for making sure it's secure. So for a lot of things, I think moving to greater use of the cloud would be the answer. Something the federal government has been sort of slow at doing, but I think the emphasis of the private sector and R&D, the use of private sector cloud providers, the benefits of the federal acquisition regulations emphasizing cybersecurity, that's a good way to partner with the private sector.
Very good. Mr. Sherman, AI has great potential to improve our infrastructure, but as we all know, it also has new risks. And we have to make sure that our infrastructure is staying ahead of foreign adversaries, and that means we have to have our AI protections in place. I've worked on this extensively on the democracy front, but I've also worked on it extensively as the member of this committee, the Commerce Committee, with Senator Thune. Senator Thune and I have introduced legislation that passed through the committee to set up guardrails for the riskiest non-defense applications of AI. Our bill would ensure AI systems used to manage our critical infrastructure undergo rigorous testing and scrutiny before it gets deployed in the real world. Mr. Sherman, do you agree that transparency in how we train commercially available models can lead to safer, more secure, and more reliable AI systems? And for instance, if a power grid wants to use AI to improve efficiency under our bill, a vendor providing the AI system would have to comply with rigorous testing and evaluation before offering the product to, say, utility companies, since that is clearly a high-risk area. We've seen attempts before AI on power grids. So please comment on this area. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's essential. And as you noted, there are several components to this, including every piece that goes into an AI application, right? The training data, testing data, the model weights, the cloud systems that are used to deploy it, right? It's essential to ensure all of that's secure. And as you're getting at, from a computer science perspective, a lot of these systems are still black boxes, right? We put in A, we get B out, and we can't tell you what happened in the middle. So as much transparency as possible is good for safety reasons, it's good for ethical reasons, it's also good for security reasons, because, you know, if you're trying to fix it, right, you need to understand it first.
Very good. All right, well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you very much. Senator Sullivan, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the witnesses' testimony today. It's a really important topic, and let me give you a little bit of my kind of thinking, and I know we've already talked about deterrence, but I really think we need to go into that a lot more. Dr. Mulvanana, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Was that close? Okay, good. I got an A for B+ for trying. You have a lot of really good background on China, so I'm gonna ask this question of you first, but then I'll open it up to really any of the witnesses. And it goes to this issue of deterrence. And let me just give you a little background without revealing any classified information. But like pretty much every senator here, right before the elections, when we had a top secret briefing with the DNI and the NSA and everything, it was all about the election interference that our adversaries were undertaking. China, Russia, Iran, primarily. So really trying to screw with our elections. I'd like to say to the Chinese, hey, you think Taiwan's a core interest of yours? You're going after American democracy by coming in when your dictators would never have the guts to stand for election. Like, this is a core interest of ours. There's nothing more important than American elections and democracies. And yet these countries feel very free to go after, try to disrupt our elections when they, again, would never have the guts to do it. Then we got this Salt Typhoon briefing. Breathtaking, I would say. Not in a good way, but shocking just how exposed we are, and still are. I think that's not saying anything that's classified. But here's the thing. In all these briefings, I was kind of like, we have our NSA and everybody else doing all their good work, and these are great Americans, but it's all about defense. Here's how we prevent the Chinese and Russians from going after election interference. We play defense. And then on the Salt Typhoon thing, it is pure defense. Here's what we're doing on defense. So a number of us, myself included, but this is Democrats, Republicans, we're like, well, what about offense? What about offense? Like, what the hell? What about deterrence? So I have a bill I'm getting ready to introduce with Senator Warren. You want to talk about how bipartisan that is. She's a liberal Democrat and I'm not. But after the election interference briefing, our bill is essentially saying, hey, if you are an authoritarian regime and you are undertaking major efforts to undermine American elections, we're going to come at you. These United States government, all of it, intel agencies, you name it, we're going to come and we're going to present to your people, not misinformation, but just information. I mean, let's face it, half the Chinese Communist Party leadership is corrupt as hell. Xi Jinping's sister is a billionaire. I wonder how that happened. Putin's the richest guy in the world. Okay, when their people get to know that, they're going to get very upset. Now, they can't know that now because of the Chinese firewall, the great Chinese firewall. We have ways to get around that. We're confident. So what I want to ask you guys all about, especially you, Dr. M, why aren't we going on offense? And doesn't that help? And don't you think if we go quietly, covertly, overtly to the Chinese leadership and say, man, we got so much, not misinformation like you're doing in our elections, we got the real scoop on how all you guys are rich. You rip off your people. You steal from your government. Xi Jinping's sister's a billionaire. We're going to let 1.3 billion Chinese know that. And we're going to do the same thing to you, Putin. I think he's worth $90 billion, all stolen. We probably even know where the Swiss bank accounts are where he steals his money. Let's let the Russian people know about that. I think that'll be a deterrence. I think the Chinese and the Russians are so scared of their own people. But why aren't we doing that? And by the way, every U.S. senator in these classified briefings is asking our top people, why aren't we doing that? Come on, we're a very powerful nation. We can go on offense here and bring some real deterrence. So I want to do that, but you're a Chinese expert. What do you think the Chinese will think if we're publishing how rich all the Communist Party leaders are? And how much they've stolen from their people.
Senator, you and I are kindred spirits. If I had a nickel for every time in a U.S. government meeting I raised this point and proposed a set of nefarious actions, we'd be having this meeting on my private Caribbean island. We'd have those.
But they don't need to be.
We cut the top of the pineapple.
I always say, it doesn't need to be misinformation. The Chinese and Russians, they put stuff in our elections. It's all baloney. You should see the stuff that we got briefed on that they were doing about candidates, Democrats, probably how bad we are. It's all lies. We're not going to lie at all. We're just going to let them know. Your leaders are ripping you off. And here are the Swiss bank accounts. And we'll let them know. And let the Chinese and Russian people know that. Maybe we'll get regime change out of that. Who the hell knows? But I think they'll be scared to death And we can do that, and we never do it. Why don't we do that?
Senator, there are two things you've raised that I, amen from the chorus. One is the United States has a pretty spotty record of trying to engage in deception and lying. Our open society, our free press militate against us telling lies abroad. The most powerful thing.
Again, I'm not talking about lies.
I understand. The most powerful thing I have ever seen in our information operations is when we simply tell the truth and the power of that. And I would only highlight this data point. The two pieces of information that caused the Chinese Politburo Standing Committee to leap higher and be angrier and exact more revenge than any other were the articles by David Barboza and Mike Forsyth and Bloomberg and the New York Times about the personal billions of Politburo Standing Committee members and their families. Nothing has caused a reaction within Zhongnanhai like the publishing of those two articles.
And why is that?
That is because they are absolutely concerned about the visible hypocrisy of carrying out an anti-corruption campaign and claiming that the party is the source of all truth and wisdom and that there is a purity to the party when in fact their own relatives are enriching themselves using their personal connections.
Okay, so why don't we go to them overtly or covertly and say, look, you're messing with our elections.
Yeah.
Our elections, right? Again, you think Taiwan is a core interest? You're messing with American elections. You keep doing this, we're going to let every one of your 1.3 billion citizens know how corrupt and rich all of you are.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? And what do you think they would do if we did that?
It would cause a tremendous amount of instability within the leadership, which frankly is not as a predicate to regime change, even as a predicate to the Chinese people making different choices about who they want to rule them and the system in which that ruling is happening. This is the most powerful informational weapon we have, is to simply hold up a mirror and say, this is exactly what we know is going on in your system. And oh, by the way, almost all of that information is knowable through open sources and does not run into some sort of intelligence equities issue related to sources and methods.
And do you think it would start to have a deterrent effect? Maybe next time they think about messing with our elections, you think they would think twice, like, I'm not sure I want every Chinese person to know how rich Xi Jinping's family is.
I have long argued that this is one of the most interesting and potentially effective wedge things we could do, yes.
Good. Okay. Anyone else have a view on deterrence and letting, I'll give you another example. You saw Navalny, who Putin ended up killing. They put that video out on Putin's, rich mansions on the Black Sea, I think, or the Baltic. And, it had like 100 million views and got Putin's attention. He's very nervous about that.
So in 2016, I was advising parts of the federal government on how to respond to Russian election interference. And at the time, they said, here's a menu of things we're going to do. Number one on the list was we would leak Vladimir Putin's Botox injection schedule. And then I said, this is the best we can do. We're gun shy, so it needs support from the Senate and from others to make us be less gun shy. The leaking the money, you don't have to do covert ops, you don't have to do anything. Just tell that's been wildly effective, but we have to be a little less gun shy.
Anyone else have a view on this? Deterrence. We're a big country. We can go to people and say, hey, you wanted to keep doing this, we're going to bring you a lot of pain.
Yeah, and being much more of a Russia specialist, of course, you mentioned, Putin, fair amount of corruption there, right? Funny how, amateur judo wrestlers become billionaires when they happen to tussle with
one of the richest guys in the world,
Vladimir, when they're teenagers. But I think as you're saying, and others have mentioned, that's an example where we can also take action to interrupt operations, right? And folks mentioned, okay, we have this 9 to 5, troll farm where people come in and clock out and post lies, as you said, about Americans and members of both parties. Okay, there's been all this reporting, right, about, the US. We went in and we shut down some of those farms and we knocked some of those servers offline. And did that stop them from getting back up? Definitely not. But
I think that's good, but it's all defense, right? That's all defense. You knock out the troll farms.
Yeah, defensive, but more of that proactive action of saying, okay, if you're going to set up this infrastructure and this building to run these campaigns, can we actually get in there and shut that down?
Yeah. Anyone else? Any other thoughts?
And so it's also internationally around the world, the efforts are already underway on shutting down the influence and power of Huawei and ZTE. But that's where it's also so important that we finish the job here in our backyard so that we have that credibility on the world stage.
100%, I agree with that. Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do think there's a lot of bipartisan agreement in the Senate that we need to be a little bit more offensive-minded and that we up the deterrence levels with these authoritarian regimes who are scared to death of their own people. And if we just let their people know, boy, look at how the leading Politburo Chinese members who talk about corruption, they're all rich as can be. I wonder how they got that. They stole it from their people. Let's let the Chinese know that. And then tell them, okay, quit messing with us, or we'll keep doing this. And your people will be rioting in the streets before you know it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Mr. Sherman, we didn't get a chance to talk about Team Telecom. And I wanted to ask you a question about existing structures that the federal government established to help ensure companies make investments to keep their network safe. We've heard from Dr. Lewis about the list that's everyone knows that people should be doing, but others are not. You recommended in your testimony that Congress consider statutorily authorizing Team Telecom, which is currently operating on the authority of Executive Order 13913, which President Trump signed in 2020. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and explain about Team Telecom here?
Certainly, Senator. So in the mid-90s, right, the FCC said, okay, we have a complex national security threat environment. Obviously, telecoms are a core target. We need to have a group of experts and other agencies talking to the commission about what those threats are. So informally, for years, it was known as Team Telecom. This is NTIA, this is the Defense Department, this is DOJ, advising the FCC on critical national security issues, including to subsea cables. So for years, this operated informally, bipartisan supported. It was renewed every administration. And in 2020, as you noted, President Trump formally made it an interagency committee. President Biden has kept that in place. So all to say, it plays a central role, and I'm happy to talk more about that, in identifying equipment that needs to be taken out of networks from China, in looking at subsea cable plans to connect the U.S. To China and elsewhere. But I think the core analogy is that we have other areas where we have these national security programs, right? We have CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. Same thing. It was executive order, executive authority. Once Congress put that into law, that was meaningful for authorities, for budget, for transparency. Still getting there with CFIUS, but that was a core moment in cementing that in the government. So I think statutorily authorizing Team Telecom would enable that oversight, would enable those proper authorities.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, one thing that I think is important to note for those that are not as familiar with the acronym SOUP that we often speak with when it comes to telecom policy, that Team Telecom, they get to work when it touches a foreign entity as opposed to domestic. And it's my understanding that outside of the FCC or others with these authorities, there's not a domestic facing group that gets kicked into gear like Team Telecom, which is all these federal agencies, including the Department of Justice, to get to work. Is that correct?
Oh, right. So one, as you rightly noted, Team Telecom is restricted to three main areas, right, including things like, is this a foreign carrier, or is this a subsea cable that would connect to, as some companies tried to do a few years ago that got blocked, Hong Kong. But the second piece, as you said, I'm not, others are maybe can speak to this, not familiar with a similar committee, interagency setup to kind of look at security risk to the domestic infrastructure, but part of that's just a function of Team Telecom, right? The focus is, and in some ways should remain, on China, on Russia, on Iran, on North Korea, and not, they don't go into domestic companies that don't have that international touch point.
Appreciate that. And, one thing, Dr. Mulvinon, that I appreciate is that clarification that both tools are needed. I certainly agree with that as well. And I appreciate that it feels like every one of the experts today expressed that in one form or another. So I just want to recognize and thank you all. I also agree with the lack of direction that could have been included from the FCC, which was published after there was a briefing to members of Congress. It should have come before. And I think there's so much more that could be done in partnership with these entities. And as we work in a bipartisan way, which I believe we will, there's a lot of interest in this space, given that President Trump is the person that signed that executive order associating with Team Telecom and looking at what tools could be strengthened in America. Contracting, simple agreements. Say if you want to do business with the United States government, these are the kind of safety tools that you need to be including to limit, to reduce the threats that exist. I've been concerned about the lack of trusted foundries that the United States now holds. This is another vulnerability that we have, not in the jurisdiction necessarily of this committee, but we should be having this conversation robustly across tools. You know, when families have to worry about the baby monitor that they purchase to keep an eye on a loved one, or who might be jumping into that to only do ill will. The threats that exist to the most vulnerable amongst us. It's not always someone that is barreling down the door of your home anymore that's going to take all of your financial holdings. It's someone that sneaks in through a text or through an email or through some other way that gets access to everything, and then poof, it's gone. I say all of that because I don't believe that this burden that we've been talking about today with this hack should fall on the backs of the American people. The education that is being put forward to the American people as to what they could be doing to keep themselves a little safer, it's acronym soup. You know, we start telling them to do this or do that or use this tool or that tool. Well, if most people knew how to do it, I think they would be. I often describe it as the same thing as what we have to remind all of ourselves during COVID to wash our hands. Simple hygiene during COVID to keep ourselves healthy and strong. Simple hygiene when it comes to using the internet, all of these tools, not clicking on things we don't know about or all the rest. But, you know, encryption, go out and talk to folks on the street about encryption and two-factor authentication and ask them who's doing it and what's going on. We're going to get some responses. There's also going to be a lot of folks that want to know how to use these things. So I hope that in the way that Senator Kennedy of Louisiana often reminds us, we need to speak to each other in a way that we can understand. And we can pretend to understand what all these acronyms are. A lot of folks don't, including those that are experts in these fields. I still remember when I became a public utility commissioner, the book that was given to me on telecom acronyms, it was heavy. And the print was very small. My eyes worked back then, and I still needed reading glasses to be able to get through that dictionary, if you will. So I hope that we can work together in these spaces to be able to get this work done. I think this was an excellent conversation. I appreciate what was shared by all of our colleagues today. Maybe my final question to the panel as I close this hearing is, yes or no, is there more that needs to be done to protect our networks? Dr. Lewis?
That's not a fair question because it's so obviously yes.
Appreciate that, sir.
You can answer for the group, yes.
Yes, and so you went on the acronyms, like make it so that all companies of all sizes can understand it. We need, as one of ours said, the paint by numbers approach for what we have to do to operate this. Don't just assume general guidance is going to be good enough, but yes.
Mr. Donovan, I want to repeat what you just said. Make it so that the companies doing the work can understand it. I'm talking about people on the street, my mom, my neighbors, nephews, and nieces. Let's talk about the importance of putting this together in a way that we can understand it and that those that are responsible can implement it. I appreciate that very much. I'd just like to put that exclamation point on that. Dr. Mulvinock?
Yes, and Volt, Flax, and Salt Typhoon are just the latest harbinger of the consequences of not doing what you're saying.
What an important reminder. I appreciate that as well. Now, in my closing remarks, as we wrap up today, I just want to enter a few items into the record. The report published by the FBI, CISA, and other federal partners titled Enhanced Visibility and Hardening Guidance for Communication Infrastructure, laying out best practices to defend our communication systems, and a blog post from T-Mobile providing an update to their customers in light of the Salt Typhoon attacks. Without objection, Now, it's clear that when we talk about these threat actors infiltrating our networks and accessing sensitive data through our national security, we're not talking about something that's theoretical. It's happening. This is before us. We're talking about the current state of affairs across all of these networks. And it's also clear that there are things we can do today to make our systems safer. Rip and replace. I'm optimistic that there is now support and language in the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act. We need to keep that in place. Telecommunication companies that were affected by Salt Typhoon must do full accounting of their network security practices to ensure they are ticking every single box that the FBI, CISA, and others, as Dr. Lewis shared with us today. I mean, every one of you pointed out what we could be doing better. Get that done before you come back and talk to us. I know they're listening today, or they have someone taking notes from this hearing. Get that done, because at least this member is going to ask you if you've done it. And we might do it in a hearing, we might do it in private, we'll probably do it in both. It's vital that companies are making the investments necessary to provide the support against these latest attacks. Lastly, federal authorities must do more to keep our networks safe. Going forward, I look forward to working with my colleagues in this room and everyone that has expertise in this space that cares about keeping the American people safe. Lastly, as my last hearing in this Congress, as the chair of this subcommittee, I just want to say thank you to all of the staff that provided support, all the journalists, some that are still here covering this today, that are sharing this information with the American people. It makes a big difference when we're talking about something so complex, but that is part of our daily lives. Together, we passed the single largest investment in broadband infrastructure in our nation's history and stood up a successful broadband affordability program. I'm pleased to see that there's support for rip and replace. We still have work to do when it comes to the Affordable Connectivity Program. 90 million people across America not being able to afford the internet when they have a hard connection is a problem. The promise of AI being able to provide a tutor to every young person in America that needs one is only as good if they can get that connectivity. We've got to get this one done. To Ranking Member Thune, I also want to thank him and his team for being such a strong partner. His availability and willingness to work together, to be able to work in a bipartisan fashion is something so very much appreciated. I congratulate him with his new leadership responsibilities and look forward to working with him in that space as well. And then lastly, Universal Service Fund. We had a strong working group, bicameral, bipartisan, came up with strong reforms and ideas. I certainly hope that that work is something that we will see more in the future, that product that actually gets to the president for signature, because this is desperately needed. A program that whose contribution factor from people that still have, here's another acronym, POTS, plain old telephone service. That's the old phone that you have in your house that's dependent on a copper connection that still runs to, you know, some little piece of equipment you see when you're driving out of your driveway or on the road. That old service, some people still use that to make long distance phone calls, even though everyone that has a mobile phone can do it for no additional cost. If you're making those long distance calls from your plain old telephone, 30% cost factor is contributing to this Universal Service Fund. It's just not sustainable. We have to modernize. We have to be smart about this. We have to make sure it works for this next generation of tools that we have. I also want to thank Chair Cantwell Maria for her leadership in this committee as the chair of the full committee, and for always making these priorities her priorities as well. To Ranking Member Cruz, I look forward to working with him in the next Congress to move the needle forward on this and so many other areas. And to the members of the committee who I've really gotten a chance to learn from, find commonality with challenges that exist in my state and in their states with where and how we can work together. I also want to recognize Betsy, who's still with us here today, learning from her and getting a chance to work with her in this incredible role. Thank you for your expertise and being willing to work here. Eric, I want to thank you. I want to thank Matthew. There's a few staff that are no longer on the committee, but John, Sean, Christy, Mary, and Harsha. I also want to recognize Ariel, who was and is part of Senator Cruz's team for the work that she has done. Alex on Senator Thune's team. He's been incredible. His willingness to work together, plan together, find commonalities where we can, agreeably disagree where we must. That's appreciated as well. Stephanie and Jeff, thank you for keeping this place running and informing us who's next, but making sure you keep this place running the way that it should. There are clerks on the committee, and then my staff, Jeff, Hakan, Shelby, Sophia, who's here with me as well, Didi, Carla, and Sarah for their expertise. This comes with so many responsibilities, and you need experts to help you through this. Now, with that, I'll close this hearing. Should members have additional questions for the witnesses, for the record, I ask that they submit them to the committee by December 20th, and witnesses will have until January 13th to respond. Thank you everyone so very much.